I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this lovely country. I've never been to Thailand before, so this has been such a treat for me, and the hospitality's been fantastic, so thank you very much. So today I want to talk to you about expanding access to transplant, and one of the modalities of doing this is using ABO A2 kidneys and putting them into B and O recipients. So here are my disclosures. So before we begin, I'd like to start with a polling question, so if you just raise your hand. No right or wrong answer here. How many people are currently performing A2 kidneys into B or O recipients? Nobody? Nobody's doing that? Well, then maybe this will be interesting to you. How many people think that this is these are safe transplants to do? Okay, so I see that I still have some to convince some people about that. So how did this all begin? Well, in 2014 in the United States, we had a change in the kidney allocation system, and one of the outcomes of the allocation change was to be able to allocate ABO A2 subtyped kidneys into B recipients. And one of the reasons that spurred this change was that there was a great inequity of access to transplantation for B recipients. They wait longer than any other blood group in the United States. So there was an impetus to actually provide some leveling of the playing field for these patients to be able to have greater access to transplantation. So there are two things that need to be accomplished to achieve these types of transplants. The first is measuring A2 ABO-A antibodies in your patients. And the way that we do that is through ABO titers currently. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The problem with this is that there was no guidance set up by our allocation system for what titer should be performed or what titer was acceptable for these types of transplants. So that's one of the problems. The second type of testing that you need to do is ABO-A subtyping. So this is routinely performed by using A1 lectin in a serological method, but typically in the United States, this is performed by transfusion medicine laboratories instead of in the HLA laboratories. And I'm going to tell you why it needs to change and move from the transfusion medicine space into the HLA laboratory. Interestingly, we're using a technique, the hemagglutination assay, that was developed in the 1900s. You would think that in over 100 years, we would have been able to transform our space into a better technique. But here we are using that same technique. So what is the gap? So as I mentioned, we put this new allocation system into place in 2014. So here's 10 years later. As of the end of last year, we have over 90,000 patients on the kidney wait list. That's a lot of people. Of those candidates, almost 14,000 of them are blood group B. And as of the end of December of 2024, 3,000 blood group B patients were transplanted, and that's only 21% of the total wait list was transplanted as a B blood group. In 2024, there was almost 1,800 blood group B donors. However, if you subtract the discard rate, the discards were 1,000 donors were discarded. So of the blood group B donors, only 741 of those donors went to procurement and actually were transplanted. So that's only 1,500 blood group B kidneys that were available for these 14,000 people. So you can see that even though we put this new policy into place, we have not moved this field very far because these patients are still waiting and are disadvantaged. And unfortunately, the minority populations make up the majority of the B blood group donors. These are the Asian and Black people. They have blood group B as a higher frequency than whites or Caucasians or Hispanics. So now we know what the gap is. We don't have enough blood group B donors available. So one of the solutions is to take another look back at the A2 kidneys and figure out how we can utilize this modality in a more efficient and more effective manner. So I just wanted to briefly talk about ABO titers because, as I mentioned, this is a hemagglutination technique that we've used since the 1900s when Carl Landsteiner discovered the blood group system. One of the problems is lack of standardization in the method to perform titers. We do DTT titers, which removes IgM antibodies, but there's an AHG enhanced method. There's different temperatures that we use. There's 37 degrees, there's room temperature, there's incubation periods, there's a 10-minute incubation, a 15 or 30-minute incubation, or an immediate spin. So how do you standardize this method when you have so many different techniques that are being used? And then there are different methods for looking at those titers. They can be done in gel cards or in tubes. And I'll tell you, tubes, we use gel cards. Tubes are very subjective. There's not a very objective method for how hard you shake that tube to determine the titer. And another thing is that the cutoff for eligibility is determined by each transplant center. So there's no standardization in what titer level is acceptable for eligibility for these patients. If you use an AHG method, you're going to have a higher cutoff point than you would a DTT method. But again, there's no real standardization, so everybody has to kind of develop a risk assessment for their own transplant center. But I will tell you that there is a better way to do this. And I'm not going to go into this today, but my colleagues, friends, and collaborators, Dr. Lori West and Ann Halpin and myself, have a manuscript under review at HAT, so I'm hoping that that's going to come out to talk about how to do ABO measurements using the Luminex technology. So Diane did a really good introduction to the ABO structure, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in this, but the ABO system was discovered in the 1900s. The ABO is a carbohydrate, right? It's not a protein. There's a backbone, which is the H substance, and that forms the O blood group. And then you have that backbone that is the H substance, and then the other sugars are attached to the end. One is the N-acetylgalactosamine, which forms A blood group, or a galactose and the H, which forms a B blood group. And if you're AB, then you have both of those groups. So I just wanted to spend 1 minute on genetics of ABO because it's not like the genetics of HLA. There's more than one gene that encodes for the ABO system, and they're not encoding the final product. They're encoding enzymes, transferases that make the final product. So one of the genes is FUT1. It's found on the 19 chromosome, and it forms the H gene. It encodes for this fucosyltransferase that attaches a fucose to the terminal galactose. So it's this terminal fucose that defines the H backbone and the O blood group. So that's the FUT1 gene. Now there's the ABO gene, which is different. This gene does not, again, doesn't encode for a protein like HLA. It encodes for enzymes that produce the carbohydrates. So it's found on the long arm of the chromosome 9, so it's not even on the same chromosome as FUT1. And it has 7 exons and 6 introns. And as Diane mentioned, they're predominantly, the ABO genes are predominantly, or that make the ABO types, are found on exons 6 and 7. So the A allele is gene is encodes for an N-acetylgalactosamine transferase. So this enzyme then encodes, will work for the N-acetylgalactosamine, and the B allele encodes for glycosyl transferase, which forms the galactose. Now, the O allele is formed by a deletion of the 261 position guanine, so it produces neither A nor B alleles. So now I want to talk a little bit about the A subtypes, because this is what's really going to move this field further. So A can be subtyped into the majority, into A1 and A2. 80% of the A patients are A1, and 20% are A2. Now, there are rare subtypes that don't fit into either of these categories, A3, AX, A intermediate, A weak, but they're very rare, and they can all be kind of lumped into this non-A1 category, or A2. And it's not that that they're different. The A1 and A2, they're not different. They have the same substance. It's just the amount of substance on the cell surface that makes them different. So A2 cells have a lot less A substance, that N-acetylgalactosamine, on the cell surface than A1. So this allows us to be able to safely transplant A2 kidneys into B and O recipients if the titers are low enough. So if the patients don't have a lot of antibody against these A1 substance, then you can do this transplant safely. And I'm going to show you this in a minute. So I want to spend a minute and talk about the current method, which is the, and I'm going to use this term loosely, gold standard for A1 subtyping, and that's using lectin. So the lectin is actually a plant protein, and it's from this Dialectus biflorus. So it has a very high specificity for A1 substance. So what the vendors do to make this A1 lectin is that they take this plant protein and they run it and they dilute out the plant protein against A1 cells and A2 cells. And they dilute it enough until they get this situation where the A1 cells still agglutinate and the A2 cells don't agglutinate. So you can see that this is a flawed system. For one thing, not all A2 cells act alike, and there's going to be differences in lots between of A2 and A1 cells. And not only that, but there's differences between vendors. And right now in the United States, there's only 2 vendors for ABO reagents. So even within this, so there's differences between the A1 lectin. So it's not, again, it leads to a lack of standardization of being able to do these subtyping. So this is what I want to spend the majority of my time on, because this is something that has been near and dear to my heart for a very long time. We've been doing ABO genotyping in my lab since before 2010. And the field has moved forward in the methodologies that we've been able to perform these tests. So we have next generation sequencing that's available to us, and that's great, and it's really gives you a definitive answer, but it's not really effective for deceased donor typing, because it's going to take about 2 days to get that result. So this is not a technique that yet. I'm waiting for whoever to develop this nanopore thing and bring it on. Right today, that's not the technique we can use for deceased donors. We can use it for our live donor transplants, and we do that as well. But what is available to us is either real-time PCR or SSP. And in my laboratory, we have a wide variety of ways that we use ABO genotyping. It's not just for deceased donors or A subtyping. We perform every deceased donor by ABO genotyping. So it's not just the A. We don't screen them by serology for A's and then do the genotypes. We do ABO genotyping on all donors. And why is that? Because a lot of our donors may be massively transfused. And so when you're doing serological testing, then you get a discrepancy between the forward and reverse typing in the serological. So this is one method that can be used to tease out the true ABO typing from a massively transfused donor. We do it for ABO subtyping. So for all of our live donors that are A's, we do ABO genotyping. So we also do serology. We also do serology for our deceased donors. But we will do A2 kidneys into O recipients if they have low enough titers as well. So, and if they don't, then we put them into our KPD program. And so in our KPD program, A2 donors are almost like O's, so it's a very good donor to have. And then we do ABO genotyping on all patients and donors when there's a discrepancy in the forward and reverse typing, and sometimes we get these. So we have a multimodal utilization for ABO genotyping. So this was the technique that we started with back in 2008 or 10 or whatever. Excuse me. The equipment is minimal. If you were doing SSP at the time, which we were, you had the thermocyclers already available, gel boxes, you pour the gels. The primers were available. We only had one vendor at the time, but there was limited in scope of coverage. But it was good for A subtyping, so it could resolve the ABO A subtyping really well. The turnaround time, I say today, is lengthy. But if it's a technique that you have in your laboratory, it's something that you could bring on because it takes about 4 hours, and you can do one at a time. So it's good for deceased donors, and the cost is low. But at the time, there was only one vendor. So another technique that we use today, and in my lab, is RT-PCR. The equipment, it's readily available in the HLA laboratory, and if you're doing deceased donor typing, then you have real-time equipment. And so if you're doing that in the lab, then I think this is one of the ways that we can move the ABO genotyping from the transfusion medicine space to the HLA laboratory. Because I would just like to say that genotyping for transfusion medicine is very different than genotyping for transplantation. The goals are different, the objectives are different, and we have different needs. So I don't think that they should be all lumped into one category. The technology is easily adaptable. It's quick, less than 2 hours. The resolution is good, and there's relatively few ambiguities with this, and you can run one at a time. There's 2 vendors available. So we run both of those vendors for all of our deceased donors, and the cost varies. One is high and one is low. So now I want to show you some of the data that came out of our laboratory in collaboration with Bill Lane at Harvard. So we took a look at 554 Group A deceased donors. So we compared the ABO serology with the ABO genotyping in all of these donors. And what we found was that in looking at, we took the historic ABO genotypes of the A2s, and we compared them to what we got with the A1 lectin and the genotyping today. And we saw that there was a great significant discrepancy in what we were calling using lectin as our arbiter for subtyping. So you can see in all of the groups, but particularly in the African population, the historic prevalence was up almost 30%, but in the genotyping, in the lectin, we were only calling about 15% of these donors as A2. So this is a very big missed opportunity. And indeed, within this study, we found that using ABO genotyping, we found up to 65% more donors that could be called as A2. Additionally, what we found was that most of the discordant results actually had weak activity. So when we scored this, back when we started in 2008, we didn't use a typical transfusion medicine 0, 1+, 2+, 3+, 4+. We were just doing weak reactivity or strong, negative or positive. So I don't have all the data from the early parts, but I can tell you that the weak reactivity was mostly a 1+ or a 2+, and the strong were 3 and 4+. So that's how it shook out. So what you can see from this is that the negative predictive value is very high. So it's about 99%. The positive predictive value is very low. So almost all of these ones that we called as A1 were actually A2 donors. Again, another missed opportunity. And in the strong, there was very few strong donors or patients that were 4+ that were actually in A2. So we also looked at our living donor cohort because, as I mentioned, we've been doing A2 kidney transplants since the 1990s. So this isn't anything new that we've been doing in my lab or at our transplant center. So we looked at 210 live donor transplants and we donors, and we did the testing by both lectin and genotyping. What we found was that 170 out of 171 were non-reactive for A2, so that was very good. 38 out of the 39 had weak reactivity that were A2s, but we called as A1s. That's really bad. And the strong, for the live donors, we weren't testing those at the time because we just assumed that those would be A1. Now, we changed our protocol, and I'll show you why in a minute, why we did that. But what you can see is that this is, it's not a good technology, so we need to be using genotyping. So how do these transplants do? I mean, it's well and fine for me to stand up here and say we should be doing these transplants, but in reality, the lab's not the one that's taking the risk. It's the clinicians that are taking the risk. But we started doing these transplants. So and this is older data, I mean, it only went through 2021, but we've done more of these. 73 patients received transplants from A2 donors from 2011 to 2021. 64 had concordance between the lectin and genotype, so that was fine. But 9 of those patients were weakly positive, so those were ones that we would have called A1, but we did those transplants anyway. All those patients did fine. They had no episodes of rejection, they had no graft loss, and many of those are over 5 years transplant. So we can do these transplants safely. So what is the gap? So again, we have underutilization of the policy in the United States. If you look at the data, and this was published in HAT in 2024, of the 53,000 plus ABO candidates in the United States between 2014 and 22, only 12% were ever listed as eligible. That's way low. So in 2021, only 50% of the A donors were even subtyped. So that's why were the other 50% not subtyped? Well, we have an allocation, our allocation policy states that if you don't have a pre-transfusion sample, then you can't subtype that donor. That's the limitation of serology. We can subtype that donor by genotype, and if they are massively transfused, all we do is ask for a buccal swab, and we can get those results. Interestingly, of those 12% of the B candidates, they were only ever listed as eligible. And if you looked at the breakdown of who comprises this, the majority of these patients are minorities. So again, we're disadvantaging, and there's a big, huge inequity of access to transplant. In our cohort of patients, when we looked at that, and we looked at our data, we find that almost 70% of all B candidates are eligible for A2 donors. So there's a clear discrepancy there and an underutilized modality. So that's one arm of the A2 kidneys. But now I want to talk about a different story. So this is kind of a cautionary tale, and we have this manuscript that is actually been accepted for print by HLA. So look for this to come. So as I mentioned, it has a very high negative predictive value, but it's not 0, right? It's 1%, but it's not 0. So what happens when it's discrepant? So what happens when somebody calls this an A2 and it's really an A1? Well, let me just tell you. So here was a 49-year-old male. He had no HLA antibody. blood group B, eligible for A2 kidney. His titers were low, makes him eligible. So he had a donor offer. So this is an import kidney. It wasn't at our local center because we would have genotyped him, and they typed him as an A2B blood group. So he's eligible. Our policy was to do a stat ABO titer. So we did that, titer was fine, performed the cross-matching. And at the time, our policy was to genotype him on the next working day. Well, this turned out to be 3 days later. So at the time, we accepted the offer and put the kidney in. He was transplanted. Well, when we did the genotyping, it wasn't an A2 kidney, it was an A1B kidney. So, and that is what we would call true ABO incompatible transplant. And we would have done a whole different set of titers. And then normally these people get desensitized. We do ABO incompatible transplants, but not like that. So we rechecked it, we sent it off for sequencing, and it really was an A1B. So now we looked at the titers, the HG titers, and what we saw that it started out as 16, which we would have desensitized, and over time that titer continued to rise to over 512. So he did show strong signs of antibody-mediated rejection, allograft dysfunction, thrombotic microangiopathy. We couldn't perform a biopsy because he had anemia and thrombocytopenia. He was treated with IV steroids, IVIG, and plasmapheresis. He developed severe sepsis, and unfortunately, he passed away. So this was not the only case that this happened. Of course, our first thing was to change our policy. If we have any import kidneys coming in, the first thing we do is genotype them. So we request blood, and 3 months later, same scenario, brought the kidney in with the blood, genotyped him first. The donor was A1 genotype, not an A2. We sent the kidney back. So it's not zero, but it does happen. So just to kind of summarize this, I think that the ABO genotyping should be mandated in the transplant space. It's different than transfusion medicine. You're not going to, if your donor's massively transfused with O blood, you're not going to put that O kit, something that types as an O into an O recipient when it's really an A. So we need genotyping. And I just want to make another plug for that it's not transfusion medicine, so we need to take this back into our transplant space. And I really believe that we are equipped and we can do this and that we should be doing it. And I have to put in a plug for ABO histocompatibility, and it's not just for transfusion medicine anymore. So now I want to stop with the polling question. So do you think that ABO genotyping should be mandated? Does anybody think so now? Okay. Yes, no, I think you're all in the last category, right? So I'd just like to acknowledge all of the people in my laboratory who work very hard for this, and also Brigham and Williams, who are our collaborators. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, and we now have some time for questions.
Yeah, Jae-suk Yang from Korea. Very nice talk. ABO incompatible transplantation is very active in the Asian area, but most Asian centers do not perform the subtyping or genotyping because the incidence of the A2 is very rare. For example, in Korea, the A2 incidence is less than 0.1%, so we do not perform the subtyping or genotyping. So I'm wondering whether is there any unacceptable titer for A2 ABO incompatible transplantation?
Yeah, so we use DTT titers, which, and we consider these transplants, the A2s into the Bs, if they have that titer of 4 or less, to be ABO light, incompatible, or more like a compatible transplant. We don't do anything different with them. We don't use a different immune modulation. We don't desensitize them. We put the kidney in. We don't even monitor them by titer post-transplant. They do fine. You saw there's no incidence of rejection, and we have no graft loss due to ABOs. So that's a different story from ABO incompatibles. We also do those, but our method is an AHG, and our titer is less than 32. So DTT titers, A2s, have a cutoff of 4 or less. HG, incompatible, is 32 or less.
I have a slight different opinion about the acceptable titer because ABMR or the accommodation is determined by balance among antibody titer, antigen intensity, immunosuppressive strength, and maturity of the immune system. The A2 antigen density is very low, less than 1/5 or
Very much.
so. If the antibody titer is high, the chance of the antibody-mediated rejection is less than A1. So in A1 to B or A1 to O transplantations, many Asian centers target less than 116 or 32. I think we may perform A2 incompatible transplantation even 1 to 64, even 1 to 128. I'm not sure.
No, I think that that's a very good point. And the problem is, it's the methodology we use to do the titers. It's not an accurate measurement of and I wasn't going to go into this, but I'll say this right now. It's not an accurate, only A2 glycan is found on the vascular endothelium. But when we do, all subtypes of A2 glycans are found, there's 6 of them that are found on the red cell. So we're measuring all glycans, but it's not specific to A2. So we could probably do 1 to 64, but we don't know. We haven't pushed that envelope. And with these, we're not doing desensitization. So we have to take a little bit, but I think we can take greater risk. What we need is better tools. So it's coming.
Okay,
It's coming. We don't have it yet, but it's coming. But I think you made a very valid point. Thank you very much again.